Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome Jim Elvidge. He is an author with years of experience as a science researcher, keeping pace with the latest in the fields of quantum physics, cosmology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and metaphysical anomalies. In his first book, The Universe Solved, he presented the astounding evidence that our reality may be under programmed control. His research and theory has continued well beyond the simulation hypothesis and incorporated powerful ideas around consciousness, cultural synchronicities, quantum anomalies, and a true scientific foundation for digital consciousness theory, which are presented in his second book, Digital Consciousness. Jim, welcome. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Chris, and really great to be on the show.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate you doing this. And the nature of reality has always been one of my greatest interests. But it's like the more I learn, the less I know. And the more scientific advancements are made, the more understanding of things gets more complex. So let's start with what got you started down this path. What got you interested in this?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm like you, always had an interest in the deeper truth and trying to understand what makes everything tick. My education was engineering education, and took a lot of science classes, a lot of physics classes, which were pretty good for kind of, teaching you the basics of reality, or the apparent basics of reality. And but then over the years, I started reading a lot and kind of learning about different alternative points of view on things. Nature of reality, physics, cosmology, different ways of looking at things, and I was fascinated by that. Because first of all, we have a history of overturning preconceived notions about things, overturning scientific theories. And that always interests me. Like, how can we go along thinking absolutely that this is the way things are, and then all of a sudden somebody says, no, we just found an experiment that proves that something's completely different, relativity, quantum mechanics, whatever those things are. So I've always been interested in that. And as I did more and more research, I guess I opened my mind more to different ways of looking at reality, paranormal, metaphysical stuff that I would have dismissed in the past, and started experiencing some things too, which confirmed some of these ideas. In about 2006, I was going to write a book about Einstein, because it was the 100-year anniversary of special relativity theory. But as I started doing research, I started coming up with this idea that, what if our reality is more of a simulation? What if it's digital deep down? And wouldn't that explain a lot of the scientific anomalies, some of the things that Einstein puzzled over for years? Wouldn't that explain a lot of those? And it really does. And so that got me going on my first book, The Universe Solved. 10 years later, there has been a lot of additional thinking in this field, in this area, a lot of experiments, and it definitely needed a new book. So Digital Consciousness is the one that I came out with last year. And so that kind of brings things up to date, and also presents, I think, the ideas that we'll talk about tonight in a little bit more of a scientific way, but also shows them with a visual model that helps make people understand what some of these ideas are all about.
Very good. So let's start with a big question. Is our reality just a matter of ones and zeros? And if so, how would you describe consciousness?
Yeah, so that's the ultimate question, I think. And interestingly enough, there have been competitions in the science world about whether our reality is digital all the way down, or whether it's continuous or analog all the way down. And there's no obvious conclusion at least from that field. People have put forth different arguments for both sides of the argument. And certainly the idea of quantum mechanics, quantum comes from the word quanta, which means a discrete amount of energy, or discrete amount of something. And originally it had to do with discrete energy levels, discrete this and that, and many scientists postulated that it really even meant discrete space, discrete time. And so you're talking about a digital construct there. I tend to believe that. And I think the evidence, if you kind of step back from the, kind of pure physics experiments and look at philosophy, physics, cosmology, some of the, experiments that are happening in the world in other fields, you kind of come to that conclusion. So to me, yeah, deep down, it is ones and zeros. And I do have to say that to some people that feels cold because it feels, digital, like you're in a computer or something like that. But that's not the case. When we watch a movie or look at a beautiful picture, digitized image of a flower garden or something like that, people cry at movies. People are moved emotionally, and the underlying construct that creates that movie doesn't make any difference whether it's digital or continuous. It really doesn't matter. So we have to get away from the kind of notion that digital means something cold and calculating, and just talk about what really there is deep down. So that's how I believe it. There are lots of categories of evidence, I think, for this idea that it's digital all the way down. And then you asked about consciousness. Consciousness is one of those words that people use in many different contexts. So conscious could mean to somebody, I'm awake, or, I'm aware. Certain animals have consciousness, certain ones don't, or whatever. But I'm talking about a different kind of consciousness. I'm talking about something that's fundamental to the universe that we are almost constructed from. And the closest thing I can say is that it's it's most likely an emergent property of a complexity of the information, of the data or the digital information that we're talking about. Get enough complexity, now it becomes conscious. A very small amount of complexity, very small amount of consciousness. It's not like it suddenly becomes conscious. Consciousness is just there, and we are part of that. And this actually is consistent with a lot of mystical cultures, Aboriginal ideas, shamanistic ideas, and things like that. They've said the same thing for millennia, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Now, you mentioned that in your book you have 4 principles of digital consciousness. Can you kind of briefly go over those with us?
Yeah, sure. So what we're talking about here is that, what we just mentioned, the idea that consciousness is fundamental and primary. So it's not an artifact of your brain or an artifact of the complexity of the brain. It's more fundamental to the universe. So that's one point. The second point is that everything that we interact with is information. And the forces that physicists talk about are rules. That's what they are. They're rules about how that information interacts with each other. That's the second point. Third is that this reality that we experience is actually illusory. It's kind of I hesitate to use the word simulation. A lot of people like to use that word, but simulation is a charged word because it implies that it's artificial in some way, or that there's a designer behind it, or that it's simulating something. But I don't think that's really quite accurate. It's fine to use the word, but what I'm talking about is a virtual reality, essentially. That the physical stuff that we see and feel and interact with is really just virtual. But it's here for us to learn and to evolve our consciousness. And the fourth point is that the system itself, the bigger system that we're part of, that this reality that we interact with is actually just a small part of, that is probably digital too. And it consists at a minimum of all of the conscious entities, yourself, myself, animals, everything that's out there that's conscious, plus this learning lab reality, this virtual reality we're just talking about. And it's driven by some kind of rule of continuous improvement. So it's a self-evolving system. Now, this is where I depart a little bit from Elon Musk and Nick Bostrom and some of the other theorists that talk about the possibility that we're living in a simulation of our own creation in the future, those kinds of things. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I think there's actually some evidence that that's not true. So what does it mean? It just means then that we're in a bigger system that has this continuous improvement idea built into it. It's sort of like evolution, but it's evolution at a very deep level.
Now, you briefly mentioned that there may not necessarily be a creator behind the whole thing. Give us some more of your thoughts behind that. If not a grand creator or someone behind the simulation, how was this started, or how do you think this all came about?
Yeah, and I've thought a little bit about that too. There are at least 4 possibilities on the origin of our reality. One is that there was a conscious entity that created it. So it could be, something like, a godlike figure, or it could be an AI. It could be us in the future. It could be, as Andre Lind, a physicist, said, it could have been a physicist hacker that created our universe. So that's one thing. Could be a conscious entity that was the originator of all of this. And then they created the system, made modifications to it, or whatever. The second possibility is that there's a conscious entity that just created it and let it evolve. It's kind of like winding up the clock and letting it, go from there. So this conscious entity may not even be part of this anymore. Might not be modifying this according to the changes that they see in the system. They just created it and let it go. Third possibility is that it sprang from nothing. And this is the sort of materialist scientific view that the Big Bang Theory was something that came out of nowhere. It just sprang from nothing. And everything that we see came from nothing. And the fourth is more of what I'm talking about. It's an evolutionary idea where, in the beginning, there may have been nothing. There may have been a void. But ultimately, that void kind of bifurcated, it split or something, and it referenced itself. And in doing that, it creates the idea of space. And if it flips on, referencing itself, now it's created the idea of time, and it may get more and more complex over time. This one, I certainly don't take any credit for this. This is an idea that came from Tom Campbell and Stephen Kaufman and some other people. But it's one that fits a lot of the evidence that I see. So in that case, it's an evolutionary process, and it didn't really have a creator. It started itself, and it follows basically a rule of evolution or a fundamental improvement, and it just keeps evolving from there. So that's the fourth one, and the one that I tend to buy into more. The first two are, you got some specific God-like creator out there, and the third one is the scientific, spring from nothing point of view. And we can talk about why those don't make sense, but it's the fourth one that makes sense to me.
Very good. And you had briefly touched on how the ancients might have had a better understanding of the nature of our reality. How much of an understanding do you think some of our ancient civilizations had about what's going on?
Well, the thing that's interesting is that when you look at the theories and the written word from some of these ancient civilizations, that they are very common. They talk about we're all connected, that there's a God that's the source of everything, that life is a simulation of sorts, kind of like a virtual reality. Maya, for example, it's an ancient Sanskrit word that means illusion. It's a central theme in Hinduism and Sikhism. So these ideas, and the idea that when we die, we go to a different place and we reincarnate and we plan our next life. Those kinds of ideas are in so many different cultures. So these are ancient ideas, and you have to ask, well, why do all of these cultures have a similar set of ideas? And one real possibility is that they have had mystical experiences. The mystical experiences are when you have a real connection to a deeper reality. And if, Siberians and Indians and Aboriginal Australians and African tribes and Native American tribes all have a mystical experience and all connect into this deeper reality, they're going to come up with the same results. And so that seems to be what happened. I think that's actually interesting and good evidence for the likelihood that they were right, and that it's a common truth. Even in today's world, people have these mystical experiences. There are cases where people just escape from reality in a way. And I don't mean in a hallucinogenic way with drugs or something like that. I mean through meditation or ritualistic drumming, or just plain, it could just happen to people. I've known people this has happened to. I've read about astronauts and scientists and doctors that this has happened to. And when it does happen, they also connect to this deeper reality and have the same discoveries. And it's not that they have them because they knew about the Upanishads or something. They may not have even known about that, but they just have this same discovery. And I think that shows that there's a deeper truth that's just common among all people across all cultures and all time who experience this, deeper reality.
Do you think certain psychedelics allow us to tap into these areas of reality?
Yeah, I think they do, and it's actually an interesting question. Like I've known some philosophers about these ideas who say that when you take a psychedelic, you're kind of jumping over a whole lot of learning that you should attain through a more normal means. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, I think of it like, let's say I'm a child playing Little League, and I go up against a big league pitcher and he throws a fastball. I'm probably not going to hit it, but every once in a while I might connect, and I've just jumped over the whole learning process of getting to that point as an athlete. But I have still gotten an experience out of it. So I think, yes, you can get some valid experiences out of these things. I think that was part of shamanistic cultures. And, but I think there's another way too. I think through meditation is actually a great way to connect with these things. And some people happen to be gifted at it and some people aren't. If you're gifted at it, I've known some people who are really, they could just drop into a state where they're, connected in this way. And that's really cool. I've had a little bit of experience there, but not a whole lot. So I think it's tough to do.
Now, how do we look at the afterlife when we're looking at it in this way? And how does reincarnation, does that play into this?
Yeah, and what I'd like to do here, Chris, if I may, is just kind of go back a little bit to the visual model of the reality. So if you imagine a big cloud, and I'm going to call this cloud all that there is. Some people might call it God, but it's the cloud of everything. And all it is information. That cloud is broken into little pieces. So there's subclouds within that cloud. And that's your soul and my soul. And that's where our consciousness resides. We call it an individuated consciousness. So they're all part of that. And this makes some sense when you hear things like we're all connected together, because we are all part of that big cloud. It also makes sense when you say, well, I have an individuated personality, because we're a subset of that big cloud. So we're both connected to the whole, which is everything, which is God. And we're also individuated. And then over here, there's another kind of cloud or some kind of construct, which is the virtual reality that we live in. So what we do is when we start a life, we connect to that. And now it's just like playing a video game, or it's analogous to playing a video game. You put on your goggles like a virtual reality game, or whatever technology you have that allows you to experience this virtual reality. You put that on, and now you're immersed in a different world. So in the same way, our consciousness connects to this cloud that I call the Reality Learning Lab, which is what we think of as our physical world. When we're done with that, when we die, when we exit the game, so to speak, now we're back into the deeper reality. We're back into all that there is, and that's where we interact with other entities, and we maybe create an idea for our next life, and that next life may help us learn to be more patient, or learn compassion, or whatever the next learning is that we feel we need to evolve our consciousness. And then we connect again, and now we're playing another round. So that seems to be what's happening. What's the evidence for this, you might ask, which is a great question. Is this all theoretical? Well, when you get into what science really is, that one aspect of science is the idea of anecdotal information. Psychology interviews people. They take information from people. They ask them questions. And when we talk to people who have had past life experiences, this is what they say happens. When we talk to people who have had kind of like astral travel experiences, this is what they say happens. When we read books about shamans and others who have had mystical experiences in the past, this is what they say happens. So the commonality across all these different ways to experience this is really striking. And I think that's a valid, it's a valid conclusion to come to, that there's some truth there.
A lot of belief systems, when it comes to reincarnation, believe that once we've reached a certain level, once we learn what we're supposed to learn or do what we're supposed to do, that there is another level or somewhere else that we're going to go besides this realm. Do you think that's part of this?
Yeah, it's absolutely part of it. So this realm that you just said is that cloud of, the virtual reality that I'm talking about, that we connect to, the reality learning lab, we'll call it. The other realm is at least where you go when you disconnect from that, when you die, or when you astral travel. It's where your in-between lies. Now, could there be more? Could that whole system be a part of an even bigger system? Yeah, possibly. I don't know that enough people have gone deep enough to indicate any kind of consistency in the story about nested levels of reality or something, but there's certainly those two. There's the one that we think we're in, and then there's the one that we're in when we die.
You've done some fascinating research into near-death experiences and how they relate to this, and even shared death experiences. Can you talk a little about that? That's fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So this is an area where I think it provides a lot of evidence for the idea of a separate consciousness. So typically, and there are some great studies, the studies done, with thousands of people in hospitals who have had near-death experiences. There's a study at, I think, Southampton in the UK, that was one of the more recent significant ones. And, basically, what they find out is there are some common experiences that a significant number of people have. It's not everybody, but they see former family members who have passed away. They interact with them. They tend to see a threshold there where if they cross that threshold, they die. If they don't cross the threshold, they come back into their body. They tend to see a light. There's all these common things that happen. Now, the skeptics, the materialist scientists say, oh, that's just an artifact of losing oxygen in your brain. You lose oxygen in your brain, everything kind of shrinks down, so that's the tunnel that people see and things like that. But on further inspection, that argument falls completely flat when you look at least two things. One, people who have oxygen deprivation in their brain but aren't in a near-death situation. So, for example, fighter pilots who experience 6Gs, 9Gs, or whatever, they lose a lot of oxygen in their brain. They don't have these experiences, and they don't have personality shifts when they're done their mission. It's only people who have the near-death experience that has this. So that goes against the idea that this is an oxygen deprivation thing. The other thing that goes against it, as you mentioned, was a shared death experience. There are a lot of reports, and there's research just in this little kind of niche of experience about people who have had shared death experiences. They're with somebody who's near death, about to pass away in a hospital or a hospice situation or something like that, and they have the same kind of visions that they have. Well, they have a perfectly functioning brain with full oxygen, so how is it possible for them to have those visions too? You get congenitally blind people who have never had any experience of visual imagery having these same kind of visions when they die. They have visual imagery in their mind, their mind's eye, essentially. None of this makes any sense, unless you accept the idea that there is a separate consciousness from the brain.
That's amazing. Now that brings me to the next thing I want to get into, my bread and butter here, UFOs and the paranormal. How does this tie into it? Say, someone's abducted, or they see a UFO. These just anomalous events that happen to hundreds of thousands of people around the world every day. And, how would these types of things fold into this theory?
Sure. Great question. And, we have to kind of state that the anomalous events are things that are happening to lots of people, reputable people. They're happening to pilots, they're happening to scientists, they're happening to politicians. Jimmy Carter saw a UFO. I think Reagan saw a UFO. The head of the Defense Department in Canada had experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's not something that you can just dismiss as, people are crazy or they're delusional. So that's the first thing. So that means that something's happening. It means that these are real experiences that people are having. Well, you have a real experience when you dream too. That is a real experience. It's not that that's fake and this other reality is real. That's a misconception. The subjective experience is all that we know. It's all that we have. And when you get right down to it, a lot of physicists have shown that the physical reality that we think we're in is not objective. There's not an objective reality there. So it kind of implies that all we have is subjective experiences. Well, that's all a UFO sighting is. That's all an abduction experience is. It's a subjective experience. Now, why is it different? Why is it called paranormal? Why is it put in this category of being weird or pseudoscience or fake or whatever? Only because it's not something that is in our consistent experience. So let's just take another example. Let's take the virtual reality example of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. You're goggled in and you're playing some game, and in this game there's trees and there's bears and there's monsters and there's stuff that you see all the time. That's the reality. That's the hard reality that everybody thinks is part of this game. Now all of a sudden some weird anomalous thing comes across the sky that most people have never seen before. What is that? Is that part of the game? What if you're standing next to somebody and only you see it and they don't? Now it becomes, oh, there's a bug in the system, or it can't be real because it wasn't, they didn't have the same experience that I had in seeing it. Well, I could program that in a video game. I just have anybody who has more than 50 spiritual points can see a UFO, and anybody who has less doesn't see one. And I'm not saying that's how simple our reality is, but all I'm saying is that these things are subjective experiences in our reality that we just simply don't have an explanation for yet. They may defy the laws of physics because they're in a different category of stuff. There's nothing wrong with the idea of having a physics engine in a video game where when you drop a rock or you throw a spear or whatever, it follows the rules of that physics engine, but then there are other things that don't. That's perfectly possible in a video game, and it's perfectly possible in our reality too. So, thinking that it's something, mystical is not accurate. Thinking that it's beings from one of those planets, attached to a star that we see in some galaxy way out there when we look through a telescope, I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense either. I think it's just a subjective experience in our virtual reality. We're already living in a virtual reality. This is just another experience that people have. Same with paranormal. So what is precognition. Well, precognition could be the idea that, you know, if this whole big thing is a simulation of sorts, that it's possible to allow it to run forward, or, you know, move ahead in the program and see where things are at, and let people do that every once in a while so they get this little sense of something that's coming, and then they know what's coming. That explains that. Telepathy could be explained by, I talked about those two cloud-like entities in a greater sea of consciousness. They could be communicating with each other outside of the band of connection to the virtual reality that we have. So there's lots of ways to explain clairvoyance, remote viewing, telepathy, UFOs, anomalous sightings, and so forth. Now, I'm not saying believe everything you hear. You know, those things that just seem outlandish and crazy, and there's only one sighting of it, or, you know, very few people. It could have been a bad dream, could have been, you know, somebody trying to make a name for themselves. Don't know. But when you get something like UFOs, where there's millions and millions of people worldwide in all different cultures who are seeing them, then you have to take it a little bit more seriously.
What are your thoughts on actual communication, like with loved ones that have passed on? You're getting information from them, or you get information from entities that are telling you these things, and it's true information that you find out, or it helps you achieve something. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's all possible, and I think that I mean, I've had an experience or two in my life that lend support to this idea, and I've known other people who have certainly read a lot about it. You know, there are times in your life when you may feel like somebody just gave you a kick in the butt. Like, what are you doing going down this path? You should be going down this path. Or, whoa, back up. You know, you're about to get yourself in trouble. And you don't know where that's coming from. It's like a deep intuition. I think what could be happening there is you're getting that communication. I think Bob Monroe called these thought balls. You know, somebody throws a thought ball at you. It was just his way of expressing it. But it could be a out-of-band communication from that other entity. Now, our relatives, people who have passed away, they're not gone forever. Their consciousness is out there. They may be incarnating, you know, differently in another, you know, another life, you know, in the reality, but they're still out there, and so they could theoretically, you know, connect with you. And the mechanisms for doing that, if everything is made of information, everything's made of data, all it is modulating data that is coming into your senses. It's not hard to imagine how this could work. And but the important thing is to realize that it's not there all the time. You don't get bombarded with this stuff, because if you did, you wouldn't take this world seriously. It's important that we take our reality seriously, because if we didn't, we wouldn't learn from it. We wouldn't say, I can learn from that mistake. Instead, we'd say, that was all BS. That was just, you know, I'll have a chance to do it again in 100 years, you know. I think there's a balance that the system, the greater system, all that there has achieved, which is give us tantalizing glimpse of a bigger picture, but mostly keep us grounded in a reality that we can take seriously so that we can actually learn things.
Very good. Now, do you think that the development of quantum sciences is going to help us understand some of these principles? Do you think they're getting closer at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where, and people have been talking about this for decades, actually. That's where, you know, physics meets spirituality is in quantum mechanics. Example, the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment is an experiment that seems to result in a conscious observation causing something from the past to change. Now, that doesn't have any validity in our real world. You know, like we tend to think of cause and effect. You know, the arrow of time moves forward. But these experiments show that you can actually influence something from the past. Another experiment shows that two separate realities can actually exist at the same time in the quantum world, where one observer sees one thing and another observer sees something else. You know, those kinds of things are, you know, not, again, that's indicating that our reality is soft. And if our reality is soft, then that means that it's not objective, it's not made of little billiard balls of matter, and it's something different.
And once you get down to the micro level, things dramatically start to change, right?
Oh yeah, and the quantum effects occur at all levels, but it's easy to see them at the quantum level, at the very small level. So, things like a transistor. A transistor is actually a quantum effect. Everything on our computers, our phones, work on the basis of this concept of tunneling. Transistors do a thing called tunneling, and tunneling is basically saying that you got a barrier and you've got electrons on one side of the barrier that can't get through that barrier. Physically they can't get through it, but the probability of the electron being on the other side of the barrier is greater than 0. Therefore, some of them get through it. And that's just a mathematical construct. It's the idea that, that nothing is physical, that everything is in a probability space. You can't say there's an electron right there. All you can say is, it's probably there. It's probably there. It's it falls into some probability range, and it's only when you observe it that the system has to lock it in. It's kind of like going back to the video game analogy. Imagine if you come across a building in a video game, a virtual reality game, and you can't get into that building. Well, does the designer have to design the inside of that building? No. It would be a waste of computational cycles to create the inside of that building if nobody can ever get inside of it. But now somebody finds a key, opens the door, and walks in. Now it has to be created. And so now that's effectively the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanical terms. We now need to create a reality because the experiment requires it. The experiment being, I found a key and opened the door. So now the system has to design the inside of that thing. Otherwise, it would be wasteful too. So imagine inside your cup of coffee, the exact position of every single particle and the exact spin of it and all that. You don't need to know that for anything. You don't need to know that to know how the coffee tastes or how it smells or how hot it is. But once you isolate one of those things, now you do have to know it. But the point is, all the rest of it can be in this probability space. So that's where quantum mechanics is really showing that the world is informational, that it's imprecise, that it's imperfect, that it's probabilistic. And by the way, I can create probabilities easily in a computational model. You get a random number generator and say, if it's between the number that comes out of it, the program is between 10 and 20, then, it's here. If it's between 0 and 10, it's here, or whatever. That's all, you can all program that. So these constructs, these things like entanglement and quantum Zeno effect and delayed choice quantum eraser, all of these have full explanations. And if you think of the world in terms of information that can be programmatic, or will have rules that can define those things.
Something really interesting that you mentioned is the fact that what one person sees, the other person could see completely differently. Example, somebody witnesses like a stick up, and one person sees he has a gun, the other person sees that he has a knife. Talk a little bit about that. I find that fascinating too.
Yeah, I mean, even just at the macroscopic level, from a psychology standpoint, they've shown that people's memories are completely fallible. I remember a professor of communications that I had when I went to school told us this story where, and this is a long time ago, that they probably wouldn't do anything like this today, but he wanted to demonstrate this. So he had somebody come into the class, brandishing a gun that had blanks in it. And the guy, yelled at him, "You've been having an affair with my wife," and, shot the professor, and he fell down. And then the students were about ready to just run out of the room. But then he stood up and said, "Hey, wait a minute, it was just an experiment. Everybody sit down." And then he asked them all to describe what they experienced. And some people said, well, the professor shot first. Some people said the other guy shot first. Some people miscounted the number of shots. Some people said nobody had a gun. You know, like they you know, when you get excited in an excited state, your memory tends to go to crap. So that's just one thing. Our memories are fallible, and when you think about what a memory is, you know, again, just looking at the model of our brain, but that is also virtual. We're taking information in and we're making connections to synapses and so forth. And when we remember something, we're not remembering the original event. What we're remembering is the last time that we pulled that event out of our memory. So if you've ever played that game, Whisper Down the Lane, that little kids do, every time you pull the memory out, it changes a little bit, or it can change depending on where you are, what your context is, how you're feeling that day. So that's why memories are often very, very different between people. Now, that's one thing. So that's the psychological aspect and sort of the human nature aspect of it. But you could kind of go deeper and say, does everybody really experience everything the same way, you know, deep down? And the answer there is no, too, because you have different eyes, you have different sensors, you have a different visual cortex than you do. You know, the processes that our mind goes through to comprehend things and to build this world, this reality that we think we're in, is multi-layered. And every one of those layers is different in every person. So you may see blue differently than I do. You may, you know, hear noises differently than I do. So your experience is going to be different. Even then, if you go deeper and say, okay, let's say we got two people who have the same, you know, they're twins, they have the same visual cortex, the same brain structure, whatever, you know, would they experience everything exactly the same way? And now you're getting sort of to the quantum question and the nature of reality question, but it's not clear at all that they would necessarily experience everything the same way either. So there's no one law of reality. There's no one truth. There's no one thing that you can say is for sure. We look at, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the Mandela effect. There's masses of people who remember things differently. That is another piece of evidence that tells you that this reality is malleable and it's soft, and it's not hard and fixed.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, chopped out a little bit there.
Okay. Now that being said, do you think on any levels that we create or manifest our own reality just by our intentions in any way?
For sure. It wouldn't be the case. It wouldn't even make sense that might happen if the world is the way the material scientists and the skeptics describe it, that it's just fixed and deterministic, and, you know, these particles are following, you know, laws of physics that are immutable and that can't be changed. It, you know, it wouldn't make much sense. But the fact that it is soft, and we've talked about many categories of evidence about how soft it is, if it's information, that means you can change that information. Your consciousness is out there. Your consciousness can interact with this information. There's no reason why it can't modify it. Your consciousness, all it is information. So that's what it's doing. Now, I think there's, you know, levels of influence that you can. Obviously, you can't say, I want to win the lottery tomorrow, or I want the stock market to go up, or whatever. You know, first of all, there's another billion people out there that might want the stock market to go down, and you can't all have the same thing, you know, happen, right? But I think the evidence shows that the further away something is, the more you can influence it. So, for example, if I want to improve my life 3 months from now, I can probably do that through intent. If I want to improve my life the same amount tomorrow, I probably can't do that. You know, it's much more difficult to do it. Or the idea of you know, doing something very specific versus something that is kind of spread out. So let's say it's I have a chronic allergy. You know, if I wanted to say I want that chronic allergy to go away immediately, it's probably not going to happen. But if I were to say, I want that to reduce, or I want, instead of being allergic to, all stone fruits, I just want to be allergic to peaches. You know what I mean? If you soften it a little bit, I think it's more likely to happen. And I think the experiments bear this out. The placebo effect and those power of positive thinking and those things, those kinds of experiments actually really do work. But they tend to work more when there's lots of different possibilities to result in the change that you want it to result in. If there's only one way for it to happen, it's much more difficult. But there are lots of different possibilities. And the reason is, I think, because, if I need one specific thing to happen in order to make the change I want to happen, but somebody else needs the opposite to happen, we can't both get our way. But if I can find some way that fits in with all the rest of the conscious entities and doesn't disrupt their intent, then that's much more likely to happen. And that seems to be the kind of thing that we see.
Now, when it comes to these cyclical cataclysms that occur every however many thousands of years, it makes me think of, like, if this is some sort of simulation or virtual reality, that it's like a reset button that's being hit. You ever had any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely thought about it. I don't know. Honestly, to be honest, I don't have a inclination one way or another about that. I tend to think of things in terms of likelihood and statistics and probability and so forth. And, I can't tell whether that would represent, a reset, or whether it's just a course of natural evolution with these, starts and stops kind of thing.
Do you agree with some of like Elon Musk and some of these other researchers, that the development of AI poses a danger for the human race?
For sure. I think a lot of our technologies do. Certainly, nuclear technology, we know what kind of danger that poses. Nanotech, if you're familiar with the concept of gray goo, designing something that can just consume everything, that's dangerous. Genetic manipulation could be dangerous, and AI could certainly be dangerous. I think that what seems to happen is that we always seem to have an edge over the apocalyptic scenario. And I think that by itself is actually a little bit of evidence for the fact that there's a greater system in here that is has some feedback mechanisms in it that keep things kind of even. So we don't go off the rails too often. Why don't we go off the rails? You would think statistically that might happen once in a while. Like if you were to create a video game that allows anything to happen, sometimes, people will band together and destroy the rest of the game, or destroy everybody else in the game, and then that's not a good thing. But the system, the programmers there would have to, put in place some mechanisms to prevent that from happening once they realize that's going to happen. That seems to happen automatically for us. So, we have had these periods in our history where we thought, we were on an apocalyptic path. Even the Industrial Revolution was one. A lot of people thought, oh, this is the end of the world, or the population explosion in the 70s. Certainly nuclear Armageddon in 1962. We were 2 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock. We thought it was inevitable that we were going to destroy ourselves. We think the same thing now about global warming and the AI apocalypse. I happen to think that something's going to save us. The thing that'll probably save us from global warming might be nanotech. AI, it's a little hard to say. Maybe it's that one's a little bit hard to say, I guess. But I do feel like that is a dangerous area.
And when you look back, even 20 or 30 years at the technology back then, I mean, if you were to take a person then and put them where we are now, they wouldn't believe some of the things that they see around us. And I imagine what it's going to be like 20, 30 years from now, the way we look at reality could completely be different by then.
Sure. Yeah. And frankly, we're not really good at looking very far into the future. There are a lot of futurists out there, and some of them are good at 5 years, some of them are good at 20 years maybe, but hardly any of them are very good at 50 years, and that's not very much time. I've seen things that, well, if we go back 50 years, we were supposed to have jetpacks and robots that did all our work for us, and flying cars and all those kind of things, and none of that's really come to fruition. But the internet came to fruition, and that was not even foreseen by anybody, or very few people anyway. So yeah, our view of reality is never too accurate. It's obviously more accurate in a shorter time frame, and I'll have to acknowledge that my view of all of this stuff that we're talking about tonight is based on my lens of reality today, and it could be very different 50 years from now. But I do feel like there's some real key elements of truth in this, because they've stood the test of time. They've been the same elements of truth that have been around for thousands of years.
And lately, the past few years, I have noticed a lot of people kind of awakening, being more curious about their reality, asking more questions than in the past. Do you see this same trend, and do you think this is something that would continue in the future?
I do, and I've had some interesting conversations with people and speculations about what that's all about. Is it a reward? Is it, oh, you figured something out, so we're going to, allow you to have some more synchronicities, to kind of keep you going? Or is it just that idea of making your reality, you have the intent now, you don't fear it anymore. So you're open to things, and because you're open to things, you're willing to see them. There are definitely cases and experimental research showing that if you don't believe in something, you're not going to see it, even if it's right in front of your face. So that's probably part of it. And so I think the fact that we discuss this, that we have programs like yours, podcasts, books like mine, TV shows that make people think about different things is causing a bit of an awakening and an opening to new ideas, for sure.
Any ideas on another book in the future?
Nothing in the works right now. I have thought about one idea, but I have a day job too, so that keeps me pretty busy. So writing a book, since that's not my full-time job as an author, I can't come out with one a year, and I don't want to do it just for the sake of coming out with a book. I don't want to do it when I have something that I think is really neat and interesting to people. So nothing immediate in the works. Some ideas kicking around in my head.
Well, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight, and your website is theuniversesolved.com, right?
Yep, theuniversesolved.com. Have a Facebook page also. There's a forum on the website where people interact and talk about a lot of these ideas, and of course, you can do that on the Facebook page too. I have a Twitter account, but I don't use that one too much. But those other ones are the main areas.
Awesome. Well, that was fantastic information, and I'll definitely have to have you back on, because there's a lot more questions that I had that we didn't get to.
I'd be happy to, Chris. It was a good discussion, and look forward to being on again.
All right. Well, you have a good night. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.